Behind marble walls and flickering lamplight, the wealthiest Romans gorged on dishes the poor could never imagine. Flamingo tongues, honey-soaked dormice, and forbidden delicacies worth a soldier's yearly pay. But these feasts hid more than gluttony. They revealed a dangerous truth about greed, power, and the slow decay of an empire. Golden light spilled across polished marble as torches flickered against gilded ceilings. The air was thick with the mingling scents of roasted game, imported cinnamon, and freshly pressed olive oil. Bronze platters groaned under the weight of rare delicacies: steaming boar, crimson mullet from the Black Sea, figs plucked green from African orchards and ripened in jars of honey. Around the table reclined Rome's most powerful men, their togas edged in purple dye worth more than a year's wages for a legionary. They did not eat in silence. The hum of conversation was a contest in itself, senators boasting of military triumphs, generals mocking rivals, and wealthy patrons laughing over the ruin of political opponents. Between each toast, slaves moved without a sound, refilling cups with Falernian wine, cooled by snow carted in from the Apennines. The diners barely looked at them. Their presence was as invisible as the heat from the lamps. Beyond these walls, the streets of Rome told a different story. Bakers rationed bread. The Tiber's docks swarmed with beggars hoping for scraps from the grain shipments. A soldier returning from the frontier might pass the domus of his patron, smell the roasted meat within, and no such flavors would never cross his lips. The same empire that demanded blood and loyalty from its soldiers offered its richest luxuries only to those who fought their wars from cushioned couches. These feasts were not mere indulgence. They were stages of power. An invitation was a political weapon, a public display of dominance. To be seen here was to be marked as a player in the Senate's shadow games. To be excluded was to be reminded of one's insignificance. Every course, every morsel imported from the far edges of Rome's domains, was a statement. All the world's wealth flows here, and I decide who tastes it. But this glittering theater came at a cost. The more the elite flaunted their excess, the more resentment simmered among the masses. Grain shortages, heavy taxation, and the unending burden of war fed a quiet fury. Even within the patrician class, extravagance was a double-edged sword, fuel for rivals to whisper of moral decay and the erosion of the discipline that had once forged the Republic. As another platter was brought forward, a pheasant dressed in gold leaf, the walls seemed to close in with the weight of contradiction. Inside, the empire's victors reveled beneath painted ceilings depicting Rome's glory. Outside, the city groaned under its own hunger. This was not just a feast. It was a mirror reflecting the gulf between Rome's promise and its reality. And somewhere in the shadows, that gulf was widening toward a breaking point. To dine among Rome's elite was to taste the world, quite literally. In the triclinium of a senator or general, the menu was a conquest in itself, each dish a trophy from some far corner of the empire. On silver platters lay the tongues of flamingos, prized not for sustenance, but for the prestige of serving what most Romans would never see alive. Beside them, the roasted brains of peacocks, a delicacy so rare that their preparation was spoken of in whispers among slave kitchens. No banquet was complete without garum, a pungent fish sauce whose finest variety, garum sociorum, came from the southern coasts of Hispania Baetica. Its aroma was strong enough to overwhelm the uninitiated, but for Rome's upper class, it was the scent of sophistication and imperial reach. Amphorae of it traveled hundreds of miles overland and by sea, guarded as carefully as gold. Even the wine told a story of domination. The finest Falernian vintages arrived cooled by snow, snow that had been hacked from distant mountain peaks, packed in straw, and carried across days of travel before melting into crystal perfection in the cups of men who measured their lives in conquests, not coin. Perhaps most ostentatious of all were fruits served out of season. In the dead of winter, guests might bite into fresh cherries from the Black Sea or taste melons kept cold in underground pits. This manipulation of nature itself was the ultimate symbol, The seasons bowed to Rome, just as conquered peoples did. But behind every dish lay an invisible chain of labor and suffering. Exotic birds were trapped in the wild by hunters working in perilous conditions. Fishing fleets sailed into treacherous waters to catch the prized species used in elite kitchens. Caravan drivers and ship crews endured bandit raids, storms, and disease to transport goods before they spoiled. For the patrician host, a table of rarities was proof of wealth and influence. For those who procured it, it was toil. The logistics were staggering. A single feast could require coordination between provincial governors, merchant fleets, and urban traders. Slaves in the kitchens worked through the night to prepare dishes whose complexity was meant to astonish, not nourish. To Rome's elite, every morsel was a reminder that the empire bent reality to their will. Climate, geography, and human life itself were just instruments in the theater of power. Such extravagance was more than gluttony. It was politics by other means, a visible declaration that all roads lead to Rome, and that the man who served such a table commanded more than soldiers. He commanded the empire's very arteries of supply. But the farther Rome reached for such luxuries, the more dependent it became on fragile networks and human exploitation. And as these tastes grew, so too did the risks they carried, setting the stage for deeper fractures in the empire's foundation. Beneath the marble floors of Rome's grandest villas, the empire's true engine labored unseen. The glow of gold above was matched by the sweat and soot below, where enslaved cooks worked in suffocating kitchens, stoking fires that never cooled. The air was thick with smoke, steam, and the stench of blood from animals butchered only moments before they were roasted. Here, the noise was not of laughter or debate, but the relentless clang of bronze knives, the hiss of boiling garum, and the barked orders of stewards who answered only to the master's table. These were not mere servants. They were human assets, bought and traded across the empire. The fishermen who supplied the rarest catches risked death in treacherous waters. Off the coast of Mauritania, nets were cast into deep, turbulent seas to haul in the prized red mullet, a delicacy that could fetch the price of a small farm. Hunters in the forests of Numidia stalked ostriches and gazelle, driving the animals for days without rest, knowing that failure could mean a flogging or worse. Some slaves were specialists, trained chefs brought from Greece, Asia Minor, or Syria, valued as much as a skilled gladiator. They could recreate the flavors of distant provinces or invent dishes designed to stun guests into silence. But their mastery did not spare them from the whip. One mistake, a dish served lukewarm, a seasoning slightly off, could bring humiliation or execution. In Rome, even genius in the kitchen was chained by ownership. The supply chains feeding these feasts stretched across continents. Caravans trudged through burning deserts to deliver spices from Arabia. Merchant ships braved pirate-infested waters in the Aegean to bring amphorae of Chian wine. Every step carried the human toll: exhaustion, disease, shipwreck, enslavement. For the elite reclining in luxury, these hardships were invisible, absorbed into the cost of doing business. Rome's political and social order depended on this invisible labor. The latifundia, vast agricultural estates worked by slaves, produced the surpluses that allowed the wealthy to host banquets of obscene abundance. Without this network of human exploitation, the display of power at the triclinium would collapse. In this way, every bite taken at the table was also a reminder, whether acknowledged or not, that Rome's glory rested on the backs of those who could never share in it. Yet the system bred quiet dangers. Slave revolts, from the Great Uprising led by Spartacus to smaller, desperate rebellions, were fueled in part by the same brutality that kept the banquets supplied. The more Rome demanded of its enslaved workforce, the more it risked instability from within. As the master's final course was served above, the kitchens below fell briefly silent. The feast was over for the elite, but for those who made it possible, the burden never ended. From these unseen corridors of suffering, the story of Rome's decadence now turns to the political theater that made such excess not only possible, but a weapon. In Rome, a banquet was never just a meal. It was a battlefield without swords, where alliances were forged, reputations destroyed, and power silently reshaped over silver platters. Every seat, every course, every cup of wine was calculated, a statement of dominance or an invitation to submission. Senators knew the rules. To host was to command. To attend was to be tested. At these gatherings, loyalty could be purchased not with coin, but with the intoxicating blend of rare food, fine wine, and the unspoken promise of future favors. Refuse an invitation, and you risked insult. Accept, and you stepped into the host's arena, where generosity was a trap and gratitude a debt. Few understood this better than Lucius Licinius Lucullus. Famous for his campaigns in the East, Lucullus returned to Rome to stage feasts as grand as his military triumphs. His tables groaned under the weight of dishes inspired by the conquered kingdoms of Pontus and Armenia. Entire rivers of fish served fresh, despite being hundreds of miles from the sea, and banquets that lasted until dawn. To dine with Lucullus was to be reminded that his wealth, like his military power, was limitless. It was politics served on a plate. A century later, another name would make Rome's feasts infamous: Elagabalus. The young emperor's banquets bordered on the grotesque, designed to overwhelm and humiliate. Guests were served dishes so strange, including peas and beans dyed unnatural colors, or meals composed entirely of one ingredient, that they blurred the line between hospitality and insult. On some occasions, he reportedly served fake food made of wax or stone, forcing guests to sit in hungry discomfort while the emperor laughed. For Elagabalus, excess was not merely indulgence, it was an instrument of mockery, a way to remind the Senate who truly held power. The politics of the table extended beyond the food itself. Seating arrangements could signal favor or disgrace. A senator placed close to the host's couch might expect political support. One seated at the far end of the room could read it as a warning. Even the choice of entertainment, poets, musicians, or exotic dancers, carried coded messages about cultural alliances or political leanings. These banquets also blurred the line between public and private life. Word of a particularly lavish feast would spread quickly through the forum, shaping public opinion. In a society where display was everything, the host's ability to stage such spectacles enhanced his political capital. But it also risked backlash. Philosophers like Seneca condemned such excess as a sign of Rome's moral decay, while political enemies used it to paint rivals as unfit to lead. In the end, every banquet was a gamble. It could elevate a man's status or brand him as corrupt. It could secure alliances that would decide the fate of provinces or plant the seeds of betrayal. As the last goblet was drained and the guests departed into the torchlit streets, the echoes of conversation lingered, promises made, insults taken, and the unspoken knowledge that tomorrow's political battles had already begun at tonight's table. From here, the story turns to a different form of confrontation, one not played out in whispered alliances, but in Rome's uneasy relationship with the gods themselves. In the shadow of Rome's glittering banquets, moral alarms sounded. Philosophers, priests, and lawmakers warned that indulgence eroded the empire's foundation. Every golden platter was more than excess. It risked offending the gods. Sumptuary laws attempted to curb extravagance, limiting what could be eaten and how much could be spent. Often, the elite evaded them, disguising feasts as religious offerings or state events. Even when enforced, penalties were symbolic, a fine or public rebuke, while the spectacle continued. Religious leaders condemned violations of sacred rules. Certain foods were taboo during festivals. Serving them invited divine disfavor. One notorious banquet offered dormice and peacock brains during a festival for Ceres, goddess of grain, a blatant sacrilege that scandalized Rome. Moralists like Seneca, the younger, decried such indulgence, warning that wealth spent on exotic foods while soldiers starved undermined courage, civic duty, and social stability. Political rivals exploited feasts to accuse enemies of debauchery or impiety, framing indulgence as unfitness to govern. The tension reflected a deeper anxiety. Rome's power, built on discipline and conquest, could crumble under its appetites. Each dish imported from distant provinces was a symbol of both dominance and vulnerability. The elite continued to feast, blind to warnings. Tables of luxury became mirrors of societal imbalance and harbingers of unrest. The empire's moral fabric strained under the weight of these indulgences, setting the stage for the decline that would follow. Rome's marble halls gleamed with wealth, but beneath their polished floors, cracks were spreading. The empire's elite feasted while resources drained from the army, the provinces, and the city's poorest citizens. Grain meant for soldiers and plebeians was redirected to fund exotic banquets. Silver and gold flowed into kitchens and wine cellars, rather than into fortifications or roads. Unchecked indulgence became a mirror of corruption. Senators and magistrates spent fortunes on displays of excess, signaling power, but weakening civic responsibility. The gap between rich and poor widened dangerously. Urban unrest simmered in the marketplaces and along the Tiber, where citizens waited for crumbs while villas overflowed with delicacies imported from across the empire. This luxury also compromised Rome's military readiness. Legionaries on distant frontiers were often underpaid, unnerved, and stretched thin, while generals and patrons competed to show dominance at home through feasts and displays. The contrast between battlefield sacrifice and domestic indulgence sowed resentment, eroding loyalty to both leaders and the state. Philosophers, historians, and moralists saw the signs clearly. They warned that moral decay among the elite would invite political instability and weaken Rome's defenses against foreign threats. History records how civil wars and invasions capitalized on these divisions, with a society distracted by spectacle and greed far less capable of coordinated defense. The marble halls, symbols of Rome's grandeur, had become monuments to excess. Every gilded platter, every exotic delicacy, reflected a society straining under its own appetites. As the empire's foundation weakened from within, Rome's vulnerability to external enemies and internal revolt only deepened, setting the stage for the empire's eventual unraveling. The marble halls that once vibrated with laughter and the clinking of silver cups now stand silent. Dust gathers where platters of peacock brains and exotic fruits once gleamed, and empty amphora line shelves that no longer carry imported wine. The air holds only echoes, reminders of feasts that celebrated power, indulgence, and the empire's reach. Where once senators and generals competed for prestige, now only emptiness remains. The kitchens, once stifling with smoke and labor, are abandoned. The enslaved cooks, hunters, and fishermen who sustained Rome's luxurious rituals have vanished, leaving behind traces of toil embedded in stone walls and worn floors. Historians reflect on these tables, not merely as symbols of decadence, but as mirrors of systemic imbalance. The same excesses that dazzled and intimidated contributed to inequality, drained resources from the army, and sowed unrest among the populace. Rome's enemies exploited these weaknesses, but so too did the empire falter from its internal rot. The contrast is stark. Wealth once meant to display dominance now serves as a silent testament to impermanence. Every gilded table, every extravagant banquet has been claimed by time. The grandeur of Rome is gone, replaced by shadows and silence. Did Rome fall to invaders beyond its borders, or did it crumble from the feast within? The answer lingers in these empty halls, a reminder that the mightiest empires are vulnerable not only to swords, but to the unchecked appetites of their own citizens. If you stood in those halls, watching gold and wine flow while the streets starved, would you see glory or decay? Share your thoughts below and subscribe our channel for more untold histories.